All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today, we are going to be talking about understanding the Support Kansas City 990 questionnaire that gets sent out to everyone ahead of 990 preparation. I know when you receive the questionnaire, it can be a little bit intimidating. The questions, you're not quite sure what the IRS is asking or getting at. So we're going to kind of break down some of the most answered questions that I see clients miss on the 990 questionnaire and break those down into English and try to get at what the IRS is asking for. So here we go. We send out two different types of questionnaires. So 990 EZs for those who have an EZ 990 and full form questionnaires. So today we're going to be going over the full 990 questionnaire. But if you typically complete a 990 EZ, I still think this training will be useful for you. We're going to be going over a lot of the same questions and information that is required for both of those. So even if you do complete an EZ, I think there's a lot of information that you can still take part of. The page numbers and the line items won't match to the 990 EZ, but a lot of the same general ideas. All right, so we'll just jump into it. So the 990 is broken down into several parts, and each part is trying to capture a different concept. And so we're going to look at each part, highlight some of the questions, and what the IRS is looking for. So part one, on the first page of the 990, line one is a brief description of the organization's mission or most significant activities. So this doesn't have to be your board-approved mission statement. It can kind of change from year to year as what you do changes. And then when we go to part three of the 990, line one, that is your board-approved mission statement. So this line item should remain the same unless you do have the board that votes to approve a new mission statement or a change made. So line 3 and 4 on part 3 is trying to get at significant changes during the year. So if you added a new program, if you stopped a new program, you would mark yes to these questions. And then it would require just a brief explanation of what changed. If you added a program, what program did you add and why? If there was a program that stopped, why did it stop? And we saw a lot of changes during COVID, just with stopping programs because of COVID or new program areas because of extra COVID funding that came in. And then line 4, the program service accomplishment. I think this is one of the most important parts of the 990. So this is a written explanation of what your organization accomplished during the year. So this is a chance for you to brag on yourself and talk about all the great things that you did during the year. So talk about the impact that you had. We always recommend including numerical data of like the number of people served, number of service provided, volunteer hours, things of that nature. So you can really show your funders the impact that your organization had during the year. And this is on the second page of the 990, so it helps kind of set the stage for anyone who is looking at the 990 to set the stage before they get into the financials and the nitty-gritty. You can really show everyone what you did during the year before they get into all of that. So we want you to kind of really dig into this and not keep it brief. And you can look at last year's, but we don't recommend just copying over last year's, but really looking at what happened during the year and writing that out. All right, and so part 4 is the first set of like yes and no questions, which is what the vast majority of the 990 questionnaire that we send to you is. And so each part is looking to get at different items. So part 4, if you mark yes to any of these questions, an additional schedule will be tacked on to the end of your 990. So if you answer yes, the IRS just wants a little bit of additional detail behind what you did during the year. So it's not a bad thing if you answer yes, you just have to provide a little bit more detail. So some examples of questions that get asked are about lobbying. Did you have lobbying? If yes, they want to make sure you're doing it correctly and below certain thresholds. Endowments, they want additional detail on the values of the endowments and activity in those accounts. An audit, we have to do an audit reconciliation. And then line 15, 16, 21, and 22 is talking about grant assistance of over $5,000. So if you answer yes to any of these questions, there's an additional schedule where the IRS is wanting to know how many people received assistance, what are your processes and procedures to monitor those funds and make sure they're not being mismanaged. Line 18 is for special events. And then line 25 through 28 is talking about related party transactions. So during the year, they want to know if you had any transactions with a related party. So that could be board members, family members of board members or officers, or businesses that either board members, family members of board members own. So if you contracted a board members, they own a business and you contracted with them, that has to be disclosed. And so that's kind of what some of those questions are getting at. And then line 34, was the organization related to a tax-exempt or taxable entity? So some of those relationships are listed below. So parent subsidiary, brother sister, sponsoring, or supporting organization. And so if the answer is yes to this question, it's one of those relationships, and there's a certain amount of control that one of the organizations have. So if it's parent subsidiary, does the parent have the ability to elect board members and make decisions for the subsidiary? And in the past, if you look back at your 990 that SKC prepared, you might have seen this answer marked yes, and Support Kansas City was listed on Schedule R of your 990. So historically, Support Kansas City has been a supporting organization. So we answered yes on all of our clients' 990s since we were a supporting organization. We have changed our status, so we're no longer a supporting organization. So if it has been marked yes in the past with Schedule R filled out for Support Kansas City, that will be no moving forward. Okay, and then we're going to move on to part 5, which is the IRS asking questions to make sure that you are compliant in all other aspects of tax compliance. So line 1 and 2, they want to make sure that you're filing your 1099s, W-2s, if applicable. Line 3, they want to know if you had any unrelated business income. And if you did, have you filed a 1099-T for your taxes on that income? And then line 7, I think this is a question that clients get confused and wrong some of the times. So did the organization receive a payment in excess of $75, partly made as a contribution and partly for goods and services provided to the payer? So a good example as when someone would mark yes to this would be like a sponsorship for a special event. So if there was $1,000 sponsorship towards your event and you determined that the fair market value was $100 because they received food and drink and entertainment, you would mark yes to this question because the contribution was $900. The fair market value was $100 for the total sponsorship of $1,000. And there's a follow-up question if you answer yes to line 7 that says, okay, yes, there was a fair market value of at least $75,000 or $75, excuse me. So if you marked yes, there's a follow-up question asking, did you notify the donor of that? So on the thank you letter that they received for their sponsorship, did you say, thank you for your sponsorship, $900 of your $1,000 sponsorship is a contribution. Okay, so then we'll move on to part 6, which has a couple of different sections. So section A goes through your governing body and management. So talking about your board members. So the first line is the number of voting members at the end of the fiscal year and how many were independent. This is board members on the last day of your fiscal year. So if you're a calendar year end on December 31st, how many board members did you have? It doesn't matter how many you had throughout the year. It's just on that last day, how many members were there? And then line 2, they want you to disclose any family or business relationships between the board. And then 4 is asking about significant changes to governing documents. So if you answer yes to that question, you'll just provide like a brief explanation of what those changes were. So I see a lot of clients get line 6 and 7 pretty confused because it is a confusing way that they word it. So they're asking, do you have members or stockholders? So clients will answer yes because they have board members. Most all clients don't have stockholders. I don't think that's applicable to any of the Support Kansas City clients. But the real question that confuses clients is the members part. So the IRS is referring to non-board members who are elected or who are able to elect and approve board members. So these are separate from your board members. So it's someone who's not on the board who has the ability to elect and approve board members. So if that is applicable to you, the answer would be yes, but everything else would be no. If you're just thinking of your standard board members. Line 8 is asking about minutes taken at board meetings. So are they taken at board meetings? Do you have minutes taken at committee meetings? If you answer no to any of those questions, there's a place for an explanation of why not. All right, so section B is talking about policies. And this is a great checklist for you to use for your organization of policies that the IRS is asking about. So if you answer no to any of these questions, it's a great time to have a conversation with your board saying, okay, we don't have a whistleblower policy. The IRS is asking if we have one, so we probably should. What do we need to do to get one of those in place? So line 11 is asking how the 990 will be reviewed by the board. So do you have a committee that reviews it and then submits it to the full board for approval? What's that process written out? And then line 12, do you have a conflict of interest policy? How is that being monitored? Do you have a whistleblower policy or a document and retention and destruction policy? And so if you're answering no, start talking and having those conversations with your board. Line 15 is talking about compensation of the CEO and other top management. And it's an explanation of what that policy is. So do you have a separate committee that works together to figure out the compensation for your executive director? Do they look at salary comparisons? We have the Greater Kansas City nonprofit salary survey that is released every year. So that's a great place to start if you don't have a policy, to look at what is fair in the Kansas City area for the position that you're looking at. And then Section C talks about disclosures. So where can individuals access your 990 and financial documents? We have a lot of clients that mark on there that it's available on a third party's website, which is great. But we also do recommend, as a best practice, that you do put your 990 on your website. GuideStar and the IRS, there's some lag time between when the 990 is submitted to the IRS and when it shows up on their websites. So as a great part of transparency, if you, as soon as that 990 is approved, if you upload it to your website, funders are able to access that and know that they're looking at the most recent and up-to-date without having to contact you for it if they need it. And then line 20 asks for who possesses the books. A lot of clients will put Support Kansas City on there, but it should be someone at your organization, whoever is in control of the bookkeeping. So if that's a treasurer or the executive director, and then use your address of where you have the receipts and things of that nature. Even though Support Kansas City, we house your QuickBooks file. If you're in QuickBooks Desktop, it's good to use your address for there. Okay, and then part 7 is compensation. This section is the listing on the 990 with all the board members, their names, their positions, things like that. And so this listing is for board members, unlike that other question. This is for board members who served throughout the year. So if someone rolled off halfway through the year, they will still be on this list. And you can include that when you send over the board listing to SKC. We can say so-and-so served from January 1st to June 30th on the 990. And then we need to know how many hours a week each board member devoted to their position. So this can be your best guess. And it varies from client to client. Some who are all volunteer, their board members work quite a few hours. And look at last year and see if anything has changed in what you're asking your board to do. And then we also have reportable compensation included in this. So this, the executive director is also included on this section of the 990. So their W-2 wages or 1099 wages are included on the 990, as well as if they receive wages from a related organization and their health and retirement and other compensation benefits. Also, if you are paying board members, that will be reported in this section. There's also an area to check if there's like a little checkbox of what each board member is. So an individual trustee / director would be a board member. An institutional trustee would be a non-person, which I don't think is applicable to any Support Kansas City clients that I've seen anyway. Officers, so that would be your president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, executive director. And then there's boxes for key employees and high compensated employees. So a key employee is an employee who had $150,000 in reportable compensation. So that is their W-2 1099 wages for your organization, related organizations, and other compensation like health, retirement benefits. So all of that combined is $150,000 or more. So if they meet that threshold, they'll have that box checked and they'll be reported in the compensation section of the 990. For high compensated employees, these are non-directors who had over $100,000 in reportable compensation. But just because there was $100,000 in reportable compensation doesn't mean that they will be considered a high compensated employee. There's some additional tests that the IRS has to be passed. So if you do have someone who had $100,000 in compensation, someone at Support Kansas City, as we're preparing your 990, will follow up with you to see if those tests are met for them to be considered a highly compensated employee. In the compensation section as well, we list independent contractors with $100,000 or more in compensation during the year. So if you do have any contractors who were paid more than that, their names will be listed with how much was paid to them and a description of their services. And then you'll have the financial part of your 990, and then part 12 is towards the end. And so it asked if you had a review or an audit. So some clients will say, yes, Support Kansas City, but we do not qualify as an independent review or audit. That would have to be completed by a third party like audit firm. So if you're thinking SKC qualifies you for a review, the answer will be no there. And then line 2C is asking if you have a committee that oversees the review and audit. And then line 3 is talking about the single audit. So those are like the yes and no questions part of the questionnaire. So now let's take a look at the 990 questionnaire, and you can see how that's set up. So last year was our first year having our questionnaire set up in PDF form. And if you do have any questions and aren't able to use the PDF, let us know and we can send you a Word document. But we like this PDF form because it's pretty straightforward. You don't have to type yes or no. You can just select which answer is applicable. So we have a spot for the date, the name of the client, and who's completing it. And then, as you can see here, we have our checklist of required schedules. So this follows the same template that we just went through of the different sections of the 990 and the questions that follow. So just going through these questions. So we have our tax and compliance section, governing body and management questions, policies, financial statements and reporting. And then starting on page 8, these are questions that require written responses. So some of these questions should go up in different sections above, but we have all of those questions down here at the bottom. For example, like program service accomplishment, we only have 4 lines for you to type a response. So what we do is we recommend that because the program service accomplishment is so important, that you have a Word document open that you use for your program service accomplishment and just send that in when you complete the 990 questionnaire. And don't try to keep it brief and try to get it into these 4 lines, but really take your time, expand on it, and do a Word document. And for example, if you had a program change and this line isn't enough for you to type out that explanation, do the same thing and have a Word document that you send in. So we just have some more like policy questions. And then at the end, we have our Schedule B requirements. and then a list of everything else we're going to need in order to complete the 990. So let's see. Let's look at what support Kansas City needs for Schedule A and Schedule B completing your 990. So this is going to be pretty high level, a quick run through. We could spend 2 separate trainings each on Schedule A and Schedule B, but this is what do we need to be able to complete those 2 sections accurately. So before we jump into that, I kind of wanted to go over the definition of a donor advised fund and how that's treated on the 990. So on the screen, you can see examples of donor advised funds. I think the most common that we see for our clients are Greater Kansas City Community Foundation donations, but this is just a short list of the donor advised funds out there. There are many, many more. It's really important that donor advised funds are tracked correctly in your database or QuickBooks because they are reported a little bit different than a normal contribution. So, for example, on the 990, if there were 2 donations from 2 separate funds at the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation, so like $1,000 from the Smith family, $4,000 from the Curfman family, on the 990 on Schedule A and Schedule B, those would be reported together as a single donation from the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation. It wouldn't have it split out by which family gave or anything like that. It would just be a single donation from the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation. And just as important, we want to make sure that donations from multiple sources are being reported separately as well. So if I gave your organization $5,000 from my personal checking account, and then $5,000 from the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation, those donations on the 990 on Schedule A and B would be reported separately. So the first $5,000 would be reported as a Lindsey Curfman donation with my personal address, and then the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation donation would be reported with all those other Greater Kansas City Community Foundation donations lumped together with their address listed. Okay, so a quick overview of Schedule A of the 990. It is the public charity status and support test. So the purpose of this schedule on the 990 is for the IRS to see that you are supported by the public. They don't want your nonprofit to only have a couple of large donors who have control of where the organization goes because they have control of the funding. They want to make sure that you have a wide variety of donors and are supported by the public. For the schedule, you need to have a database or a consistent method for tracking your donors in order to accurately report Schedule A and Schedule B. On Schedule A, we're reporting monetary donations as well as in-kind goods. And then for the monetary donations, the fair market value is not included. So for example, that $1,000 sponsorship donation sponsorship with a fair market value of $100, the $900 contribution portion would be reported, not the total $1,000 sponsorship for Schedule A. So there's 2 parts to Schedule A, and depending on what type of nonprofit you have, how it's set up, determines which part you complete. I think the vast majority of our clients complete Part 2, but we do have some clients that do complete Part 3. So Part 2 is a little bit easier to report compared to part 3. So it's a rolling total for your top, your largest contributors, and how much they've given to your organization in the past 5 years. On part 2, donor advised funds, public charities, and government agencies are excluded from this calculation, which helps out your organization's public support percentage. So this is the first reason it's really important that we track donor advised funds accurately, because if in QuickBooks you have that my donation to your organization, you just have my name in there and don't note that it's a Greater Kansas City Community Foundation contribution, my donation could affect your public support percentage for the negative. So if you are able to correctly track that, you can exclude my donation, increasing your public support percentage. Okay, part 3 is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to kind of go over this quickly. And if you do complete part 3 and are confused about this, we can talk about it separately with an actual Schedule A to help go over it. But part 3 is looking at major donors from the inception of your organization. And so once someone is a substantial contributor, they will always be a substantial contributor. And then we also need a listing of disqualified persons. So the definition is any person who is in the position to exercise substantial influence over the organization. And so examples of that would be board members, CEO, CFO, and donor advised funds. So it also includes members, family members of disqualified persons, so spouses of board members, CEOs, things of that nature, or any entities that they control. So if a board member owns their own business and they're donating from their business, those are also disqualified. But they are only disqualified for as long as they have control over the organization. So if a board member gives throughout their time on the board, those will be excluded, but after they leave the board, any donations they give will not be disqualified. And there is no donation threshold. So if a board member gives $100, that needs to be reported as a disqualified contribution. There's no threshold like $5,000 or anything like that. All right, so we'll jump into Schedule B. So this is the last schedule that we provide you on the 990. And if you look at what Support Kansas City provides you, we have the 990 and a separate Schedule B sent to you separately. That's because Schedule B is only only reported to the IRS because it's a listing of your largest donors. So if you go on to GuideStar, you shouldn't be able to see anyone else's Schedule B because it's not required that you're disclosing that information to anyone in the public besides the IRS. And so if you are uploading a copy of your 990 to your website, you can exclude that Schedule B part, and that's why we send those to you separately. So the calculation for who's reported on Schedule B, if you're a smaller organization, the threshold is $5,000. So anyone who gives $5,000 or more is reported on Schedule B. If you're a larger organization, there's a special rule, so you don't have to report every single $5,000 donation that you receive. So for example, if you had $1 million in contributions during the year, 2% of that would be to $20,000. So you would only be required to report contributions above $20,000. So it saves you some time writing all of those and calculating and getting all the addresses for those donors. And you use whichever is larger. So if 2% of your contributions is less than $5,000, then you'll use that $5,000 threshold. Same thing for Schedule B. As Schedule A, we're looking at monetary and in-kind donations. So if you received food from harvesters over, let's say, $5,000, that would also be included on Schedule B, even though it's not a monetary donation. And then we also need addresses for each of those donors. All right, so that is everything that Support Kansas City needs for your 990 questionnaire and to be able to complete that. So some tips for filling out the 990 questionnaire. It's always great to have last year's questionnaire, last year's 990, and this year's questionnaire all pulled up at the same time, and making sure you're being consistent between years. As a preparer, sometimes we see that one year you marked yes, you had a whistleblower policy, the next year you marked no, and then this year you marked yes. So making sure you're being consistent and accurately reporting what happened. And if there was a change during the year, that's being reported correctly on the 990. And then use that help button on the 990 questionnaire. If you're not quite sure what the question's asking, or if you're not quite sure if what you think is a related party is a related party, use that or reach out to the 990 preparer who sent you your questionnaire and ask them, and we can follow up with additional information. And as you complete your questionnaire, here's a list of everything that we need. So we need your completed questionnaire with ideally a Word document with your program service accomplishments, a listing of your board members during the year and how many hours a week they devoted to their position. We need a listing of donors over 5,000 with addresses. And then if you complete Schedule A Part 3, we need a listing of donations from just qualified persons. So board members, executive directors, things like that.